Last time we left off talking about private universities and how they sort of run the country. And that's sort of the case. I mean, it's changing. Public is becoming important again, ever more important. But it wasn't always so. The private universities were quite as important as they are now and have been for quite some time. As we mentioned last time, it was public universities, and particularly the UNAM, who ruled supreme.
The UNAM being, of course, the National Autonomous University of Mexico.
But the rise of private universities, which we didn't discuss last time, really comes about mostly because of crises that happen across the Mexican nation. It begins in the late 1960s, but the really hard stuff happens throughout the 1980s. It's a complicated set of things, but basically throughout the 1980s and up until the early 1990s, the country agrees that the government is a combination of untrustworthy and just basically useless. And that gives a space to be filled by private universities. Now, when the government is seen as useless, all of its institutions are sort of tinted with this reputation as well. And that applied to universities. Now, the reputation was not necessarily entirely unfounded. Massive economic crises for over a decade did lead to a sharp decline in funding. It led to growing corruption. It led to maybe well-intended, but ultimately significant amounts of populism that affected the quality of the public education system for some time. But these are old institutions with a storied past, and though they were affected, you can't say they went from being great institutions to overnight being terrible institutions. Many great things remained. And more importantly, if we look back before the 1980s, before the 1970s, we need to remember that Mexico is built on the back of these public universities. Private might be important now and they might have done great things, but the Mexico of the Mexican miracle, of the great authors, great diplomats, humanitarians, and Nobel Prize winners are mostly the product of the public university system, not the private one. So today, we're covering Mexico's public universities.
I will, of course, have to push back a bit. I think there's a lot of prejudice, isn't there? I know a lot of companies that almost deliberately don't hire public university students, even though they might have been the best, because they're not a culture fit, quote unquote. But of course, it's just prejudice. As you well say, public universities are still a massive part of Mexican public life, but also corporate and academic life. They are still bastions of intellectual prowess. And so it's interesting to see their rise and fall and where they lie currently in Mexican public life.
I think they remain very important in public life, certainly. I think one of the big changes that happens in the 1980s where private university becomes more important is that the leaders of the private world once studied at public universities as well, and now they mostly study at private universities. And that's a big difference because suddenly there's this public-private divide. But the other thing is these universities are not just important because they're still relevant in sort of public discourse and in the public intellectual life, but also because of a very simple thing. It's the economy. It's a cost issue. Stupid. It's a cost issue. So when I studied at the ITAM back in the late 2000s, early 2010s, the cost of a single month of a normal, fully loaded set of credits was roughly half of the average entire household income of a Mexican household, which is insane.
We discussed this last time, right? Which is private universities can say all they want about how good they are, but really they are elitist clubs. They are deliberately constructed as very well-financed, very well-educated clubs for the elite to hang out with each other to a greater or lesser extent in different universities, but that feels like it's the sort of broad connecting point between all of these different private universities.
Certainly. And the TEC and the ITAM and the Ibero all give an enormous amount of scholarships, and there's people from all sort of social backgrounds there. But there is a massive bias towards people that look and talk a particular way and that come from a particular set of neighborhoods for the most part. But the rest of the population needs to go somewhere else. And this is the public university system. This being a massive country, it has a massive number of universities. So we're going to try and cover the most emblematic, the most representative of all of these, the most important one.
So how do you propose we go through these universities? What's your list going to look like and how are you going to organize it?
So I want to go through 4 groups. And one of those groups is a university unto itself. This is the UNAM, of course. The second group is what I like to call the Mexico City Titans, because these are 2 massive universities, both in Mexico City. Then we're going to talk about the state schools. And obviously there's way too many of them, so we're going to cover only a few. And then finally, we're going to focus on elite research institutes, of which there are many, but we will talk about possibly the most famous of them all.
I like it.
But before we get into all of that, I want to say that what's beautiful about the public university system is when you look at its history, it is very clearly the product of the dream that has been the Republican project of Mexico.
Well said.
The Mexican public university system starts in the 1910s, still during the government of Porfirio Diaz, who, though he was a dictator and is very heavily criticized, is ultimately a big leader of the reform movement of the 19th century, a significant statesman and shaper of the country as it is today. And all the universities that follow are universities that come after the revolution, and they are very much part of a stately project developed in the course of the 20th century. The UNAM, which we said is set up in the 1910s, it likes to call itself sort of the symbolic heir to a university that had been founded in the 1550s and so on, in the times of the Viceroyalty. But really, it is an entire independent, secular institute.
This is an ongoing theme throughout this particular conversation because there are so many public universities in Mexico that were founded after the revolution, but that claim some sort of legacy from previous institutions in the distant past. And so I like that we'll mention these as we go through them, and our listeners can decide whether or not they believe them.
It's a deeply Mexican thing. Everyone likes to claim our heritage of the Aztec Empire and so on, even though, well, that was a very long time ago. But the UNAM, as a national university, is not only Mexico's most important university, it is also by far the largest. The numbers vary depending on which sources you look at, but at the moment, it's estimated to have around 370,000 students, which is the size of a fairly large city. It is truly a behemoth. In fact, it's such a behemoth that I think it deserves its own episode.
I think you're absolutely right.
So we'll talk more about the UNAM next time, but it suffices to say that the UNAM is unequivocally the largest, most important, historically and otherwise, university in Mexico. But if we move on to the UNAM, what else is left? So we move on to this category which I call the Mexico City Titans, and there are two of them in there. You have the Instituto Politécnico Nacional, known as El Poli for Polytechnic, and the UAM, the Autonomous University of Mexico. Not the National University, so it's not UNAM, it's just the UAM.
Poli has a fascinating history, and that, to me, the one that most titillates me, because it also was founded after the revolution, very much with revolutionary principles in 1936 by President Lázaro Cárdenas, who we've mentioned over and over again. He's the man who nationalizes oil and creates Pemex. He's this sort of like left-wing bastion. And he creates the Politécnico very much with the idea that we need technically minded and educated people in Mexico to develop the country. Sovereignty, technological sovereignty is a big thing. But funnily enough, and I love this, the Poli traces its lineage to before the revolution to two specific schools. The first is, kind of obviously the College of Electricians, a very Porfirian institution. And of course, the National College of Homeopaths.
Of course. I didn't know that. I love that. But as you say, it being founded by Lázaro Cárdenas, it fits beautifully into the story of public universities as clear mirrors of the national project that is the Mexican Republic. We have a national university that is from before the revolution. We expanded after the revolution, but we need more universities. We need more institutions, and thus comes the Poli. The Poli is a very small university. It's only the miserable 170,000 students, so about half the size of the UNAM. Pathetic, yeah. But it does boast quite an illustrious number of alumni. Famously, it is one of the few universities other than the UNAM to have produced a Mexican president, Ernesto Zedillo, president from 1994 to the year 2000, studied economics there. And it has also produced the inventor of something that Mexicans are very proud of, at least Mexicans of a certain age. Do you know what that is, Alex?
A man called Camarena, I'm assuming you're going to mention, the man and the team who created color television.
Indeed. I remember as a kid hearing this a lot from my grandfather, from my dad. It was like, wow, we, the Mexicans, invented color television.
And sadly, it's not even the same technology used today. So it's, like the old tubes in a box sort of color television, not LEDs.
Don't pop the bubble, okay?
It links to something that I'm obsessed with and sort of depressed by, but also very keen to talk about, which is how we've betrayed the founding principles of institutions like El Politécnico. Lázaro Cárdenas created it so that Mexicans could design their own future to the benefit of humanity, of course, but so that Mexico could create the technological basis on which its economy could progress. And what I find to be very frustrating is we went from this sort of 1940s, 1950s creation of new technologies at a world level to this strange, interestingly privatized, so to speak, system where what people at the Poly really celebrate nowadays is sure discoveries and stuff, but it's legitimized by prizes by foreign private companies. And so everyone's really happy about Google giving a Polytechnical student a prize, or a pharmaceutical company using a Polytechnical active ingredient to make their very profitable drugs in another country. And I think that's an interesting link towards the current day strategy of creating Mexican-based technology for Mexican industry, because that's something that's really been missing. I had a wonderful and heartbreaking story in the Mexico Political Economist that really hits home on this point. Have you ever heard of something called the Lagarto Project?
It rings a bell, but tell me more.
So the Lagarto Project is a project, an academic project from the Information Technologies department in El Politécnico, El Poli, and it's started about 10 years ago, a decade ago, as a very academic endeavor, which is let us create from first principles a semiconductor, a Mexican semiconductor, very much an academic endeavor, transistors, basic transistors on and off, basics. But 10 years went by and people collaborated and worked on it, and they ended up with a pretty advanced chip designed by Mexicans at a Mexican university. The issue, of course, was there wasn't enough money to create a prototype. More or less at the same time, this is, in the early 2020s, the Chinese and the Americans are racing to create semiconductors and to develop them, and the Europeans get sort of worried. So they pass something called the CHIPS Act, and they distribute amongst the different European countries who gets to do what. So the French and the Germans get the big factories, and the Spanish, specifically the University of Barcelona, get the design. And funnily enough, El Poli has a relationship with the University of Barcelona. And so they get together and they say, my God, this is a win-win. You, the Mexicans, can provide your design for this chip. We can fund it with this European money. And so they work on it. And it's amazing because it's a success. And so the Europeans get to advance their chip technology, and they've been moved ahead by 10 years thanks to this Mexican technology. And the Mexicans in the Polytechnico get a really nice pat on the back because it worked. And that's it. And so it's us handing away our hard-earned technology and research because there's nothing that continues from the academic research. Do you know how much they needed for that prototype, Dawo?
That's going to break my heart.
It's going to be pathetic, isn't it? It's going to be the lunchtime bill for some swanky VC. It was $20,000.
That can't be.
Yeah.
That's
But
terrible.
of course, Polytechnico, as you well said, is defined by budget cuts from the 1980s onwards, and a sort of different measurement of what success means based on sort of these abstract prizes and handing over very well-trained people to multinational corporations. Sorry, that's my rant.
And that's wild because I remember back in 2014, they were trying to change the regulations under which the Poli was governed. And there were these massive protests because protesters argued that they were trying to turn the Poli into more of like a technical school as opposed to a proper university. And the protests succeeded, which, suggests that there was a measure of truth in what they were saying. But what's crazy to me is when this happens and the government decides to retreat and say, let's keep this as a university, it doesn't come with any sort of reform that will create budgets that allow the university to function as a university that continues to produce university things, particularly for a technological university, but rather just let it keep being what it is, which is an institution that is very respectable, but that came out quite damaged from the crisis of the 1980s and is burdened by bureaucracy and burdened by budget cuts. But sadly, that is the reality of most of the public universities in the country. Now, a university that's created before these massive budget cuts, and our next university is the UAM, Metropolitan Autonomous University. And it was created in the 1970s, sort of in this new wave of the PRI that we've discussed in the past, where the PRI governing party is sort of taking a look back at itself and acknowledges that something needs to change in the model, and it's a sort of new left-wing perspective on things. And that wave of the PRI was mostly a catastrophic failure. However, in that misled understanding and implementation of left-wing-ism that was filled with failures, the UAM has been mostly a great success. It is much smaller than the Politécnico and the UNAM at a miserable 60,000, so still a massive university. But when it was created, the idea was that it should be more nimble and less bureaucratic than its peers. Despite it having been created before the 1980s, and then, of course, having suffered similar problems as the UNAM and the Politécnico, it is recognized for being slightly more nimble, and it is recognized for having a very high academic level. Though, of course, it cannot boast the massive, illustrious alumni group that the Politécnico or the UNAM has, it has produced a very substantial number of illustrious alumni, most notably possibly is Guillermo Ortiz, who we discussed in our Banco de Mexico episode. He is the man who led Mexico's central bank as it became autonomous and led Mexico out of near hyperinflation.
The one is also an interesting reflection of the evolving makeup of Mexican political divisions. Mexico City was home of these massive titans that were federal institutions. So you've got the Polytechnical and you've got UNAM, but they're both run by the national government. It says so in their names. UAM is a different approach because a lot of folks, if you're from Querétaro or if you're from Yucatan, you can't get into the UNAM. There's a bunch of state universities that we'll get to in a second that will happily open their doors to you if you don't get in or if you want to stay close to home. But if you want a sort of Mexico City equivalent to these national titans, you couldn't really get one in the public sphere until the creation of the UAM. So it's also a big moment for Mexico City as it transitions from being a centrally run federal district to a city that runs itself as well.
It's a sort of Mexico City state university that isn't a national university.
Exactly right.
And in that spirit, our third very large group are the very many state schools of the country. Now, I think pretty much every state, correct me if I'm wrong, Alex, has a public university. But what varies significantly is the quality and reputation of these universities. Some states have multiple. They're big enough and rich enough to do that. And some of these universities have extraordinary reputations and have an enormous breadth of courses that they can offer. Others have chosen to specialize and have gained substantial reputation. Now, we cannot possibly cover all of them, nor would you ever want to hear about them because there's a lot of them. But there are three that stand out before their breadth and the quality of their education. Can you guess, Alex, which are these three?
That's interesting. I'm guessing it's going to be big, important states, and it's going to be those with a history to them. So I'm guessing we're talking about the state of Puebla, the state of Nuevo León, and let me throw one out there, maybe the state of Mexico, each for different reasons. Puebla, because it's sort of historical industrial prowess. Nuevo León, because it's the new economic center of the country. And the state of Mexico, simply because there's a lot of people.
Good guesses. I thought you would miss Puebla. I had no idea Puebla was that important. Puebla
I am biased, of course.
Yes. I figured there would be problems at home if you didn't guess that. But Puebla is very important. Nuevo León, certainly. In Monterrey, the capital of Nuevo León. But the third is not Estado de Mexico. Good guess. It is La Universidad de Guadalajara, Mexico's second city, of course.
I sort of felt it, but I'm from the state of Mexico, so I thought I'd try to big it up. But yes, I did suspect that one of the most important states in the country would get that title.
Of these three universities, so the bulk of the presidents in the country after the revolution, we have said they've come from the UNAM. We have the Politécnico has Ernesto Zedillo. We've talked about a few of the privates, well, the only private ones that have produced presidents. Of these three, can you guess which is the only one that has produced a president?
Ooh, that's a tough one. It definitely won't be Monterrey. It'll definitely be Puebla, just because of the history, the weight.
Done. Well done, Alex. I'm proud.
Now, the question is, who was it? Was it Díaz Ordaz?
That's excellent. Have you been doing your research before this?
No, I haven't, but it's all just educated guesses.
He studied law at the Universidad Autónoma Benemérita de Puebla. But these universities, storied as they are and large as they are, they're not that interesting. They're just the state version of equally important and bigger universities that exist in Mexico City.
Dare you?
How dare I indeed?
I disagree. Let me chip in here for a second. I think that they bring something fascinating to the table, which is their local expertise. You're quite right. On paper, they look very much the same. But I think they each bring something fascinating to the table on the basis of what each state brings to the table. I'm always obsessed with the Universidad Veracruzanas, like the nature of the University of Veracruz, La UV as it is known. And it's fascinating because it's based in the capital of Jalapa, where only two things happen. Three things, if you're lucky. The first is politics, because it's the capital. The second is art, song, poetry and all that, music. And the last one, of course, is academia. And it's because there's no industry there. They produce things of the mind and of the tongue. And therefore, La UB is a fascinating place for you to study something like literature. And it's the first publishing house that truly took an interest in a young Colombian author named Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And it's fascinating because some of his first works were published through the publishing house at the Universidad Veracruzana, but in classic Mexican fashion. Budget cuts and all that meant that ultimately Garcia Marquez felt that he was trapped there because they published a few books and then refused to publish any more because they didn't have any money to print any more. And this was a man who was fast becoming famous. And so he had to rip himself out of that public institution and into the private sector because he was on his way to publish a little ditty called 100 Years of Solitude. And he realized the Universidad Veracruzana is not the place to do it. But that's the place where he got his first editorial sea legs, so to speak.
That's very fair. And it is true that many of the smaller state universities, their big success is that they have known to specialize in a few very specific things. So Universidad de Veracruz is particularly good at literature, has the publishing house. The Universidad de Colima is famous for its work in marine life sciences, the same for Universidad de Baja California. Universidad de Sinaloa for agriculture, and that's not me being funny just because the state has a reputation for growing drugs. They're actually highly regarded for their work in agriculture. But maybe the most interesting of these smaller niche ones is the Universidad de Chapingo.
Yes, I was going to say there's a beautiful subsection within your category of state universities, which I would call the decentralized federal universities, which are still technically in the states. They're not in Mexico City, but they're run nationally. The two of them are probably I think, believably continuous university. I know the UNAM will be angry and the College of Homeopaths will be furious at me, but it's the University of Chapingo because they have direct links to the National Agricultural School, La Escuela Nacional de Agricultura, founded in the middle of the 19th century, very clearly to boost Mexico's agricultural production, insert a bit of positivism into it. The Universidad Chapingo, which used to be based in Mexico City, but has since decentralized into the state of Mexico, into the town of Chapingo, the old hacienda there, for people to study, to become agronomists and agricultural engineers. What I think is fascinating is the evolution of Chapingo shows you the evolution of Mexico. First, you've got everything to do with La Hacienda, which is this sort of agricultural unit inherited from the Spanish that does both livestock, a bit of industry, and a bit of agriculture, all put into one sort of economic unit that was the basic economic unit of Mexico up until the 19th century, up until the revolution, when the haciendas were kicked out. And so back then you had the ENA, which became Chapingo, having, sure, agricultural studies, but also you had veterinary studies and other hacienda-based studies. After the revolution, they incorporate the veterinary studies into the UNAM, so Chapingo, I'm calling Chapingo, loses that, and it becomes incredibly focused on how to make land that has been decentralized productive, because, of course, a mainstay of the ideological reasoning behind the Mexican Revolution was the redistribution of land, the destruction of the haciendas, and the creation of these communally owned ejidos and stuff. And so Chapingo and its forebearers were meant to go out into the countryside and teach the peasantry how to become proper agricultural workers. So it's very top down. And then they're a central part of the Green Revolution that happened in Mexico as well as around the world. And then they're part of the sort of critique to the agricultural revolution after the 1970s, when, sure, we've had enormous crop yields increases, the Malthusian trap is no longer an issue, but it's the destruction of the earth and the sort of salting of the earth by these industrial agricultural means. And so today, Chapingo, even though it's almost become the butt of a joke by these urban intellectual elites who see it as sort of parochial backwater in the middle of nowhere, it still is the sort of heart of the really big debates that happen within the agricultural sphere. So industrialization versus ecological farming, sovereignty versus industrial export farming, all those debates are happening today at this university.
Are they the guys who are also really focused on corn and ensuring that we don't lose the local indigenous corn?
That's exactly right. It's part of the debates, right? These phrases that we hear so often, sin maíz no hay país, without corn, without maize, there is no country. These are the people who are actually thinking through what that means, right? Does it mean we have to produce a lot of one species of corn to keep us fed? Or does it mean we have to be slightly less efficient, so to speak, and produce different varieties of corn? We've discussed how the richness and biodiversity of Mexico's food is an essential part of its tradition, but also an essential part of keeping the country afloat to a certain extent. We've covered this a bit in the Mexico Political Economist, so I'll link to both that podcast and a report on the maize industry. But yeah, Chapingo is where these debates are.
It's fascinating. I have to admit, I'd only really ever heard of Chapingo in the context of it being the butt of a joke.
Yeah, literally. I mean, me too, to a certain extent. And it's fascinating because, of course, it is one of the best universities in the country. It's in the top 5 public universities, and that includes UNAM, that includes El Politécnico. So it's really up there. It's just a niche university to people who live in cities like us. And for better or worse, Mexico is very much run by its urban elites.
Fascinating.
Most recently, funnily enough, there's this added university to this category of federal but not in Mexico City category, which is the Rosario Castellanos universities, a new network of universities created by Claudia Sheinbaum very recently, and in reaction to the fact that even though they're massive universities, these big federal universities and state universities simply cannot accept every single one of the students that apply to them. That's a big issue in Mexico. We discussed it in the first episode about how this ecosystem of private universities that are actually pretty crap emerged to fulfill that need, that market need for university students. And so what Claudia Sheinbaum did was create a university. We don't know how good it'll be because it's so new, but it's a university called El Sistema Universitario Rosario Castellanos. And this university is based outside of Mexico City deliberately, specifically in rural areas, to take up the poorest rejects from the national university application process. And so this new university is cropped up all around Mexico, mostly outside of the cities and definitely outside of Mexico City, to take up the surplus youth that wants to study at university but didn't quite get into UNAM.
That's a brilliant move. Let's see how it pans out. But maybe one very quick honorary mention before we move on to our very last group. There is one university, a state university, which is actually the oldest university in Mexico. Do you know what I'm talking about, Alex?
Oh, no, I don't. You've got me this time.
Aha. This is the Universidad Michoacana de San Nicolás Hidalgo.
I was on the tip of my tongue. I should have said it.
But that actually might make more sense if I tell you that that university is in Morelia, formerly known as Valladolid, of course, in the era of New Spain. And this is the university, back then it was the Colegio de San Nicolás, where the bulk of Mexico's independence revolutionaries studied. And it is not only the oldest university in Mexico, it is the oldest university in the American continent.
I bet the Peruvians will be upset and come up with a counter argument. This is the constant debate.
I actually looked this up because I knew that they would be like, Peru, maybe. Yeah. So actually, the oldest, there's 2 universities that are usually referred to as the oldest. There was one in New Spain and there was one in Peru. And they were both from the 1550s, but with a few month difference. And the Peruvian one is older. However, the Universidad Michoacana de San Nicolás Hidalgo, Colegio de San Nicolás, once upon a time, is 11 years older than both of them.
Wow. What weird that it's never mentioned, but I'm very excited to hear more.
I actually have nothing more to say because sadly it's not that important anymore. It's fallen on bad times, but I did want to mention it because it used to be very, very important and it's still around.
We'll have to do a whole episode about it someday, but not this time round.
It is not today. Our last group is it's a group of very small universities, but incredibly important. I call them the elite university of the public system. So there's many in this group. I'll mention a few, like the Instituto Mora in Mexico City or the CIDE in Mexico City, the CIDE having produced a very large number of highly respected lawyers, economists, and politologists, many of whom work at the highest levels of government in Mexico and abroad. There's the Colegio de San Luis, famous for its work in the humanities and social sciences. That's in San Luis Potosí. And there's many others. But possibly the most important, the most respected of them all is the Colegio de México, also known as El Colmex.
Of course, one of the obvious things to me when I hear El Colegio de México is that it was founded and funded by Spanish refugees in the 1930s.
Of course. So that's, I think, it's a beautiful part of the story because in the 1930s, 1939 specifically, Lázaro Cárdenas, who also founds the Politécnico, he's the only statesman to openly take in Spanish refugees during the Spanish Civil War.
Not only Spanish refugees, it took in the Spanish Republican government, which is an essential point. Because not only are you getting an influx of some of Spain's best intellectuals who, believe it or not, tend to be left-wing, and so all these Spanish intellectuals get shoved out of Spain, they come to Mexico, they populate the UNAM, but of course they create their own research institution, which was back then called Colegio de España, and it is funded in large part by the money that was brought from Spain through the Spanish Republican government.
So it's actually La Casa de España. And yeah, when they come in, they set up shop as La Casa de España with the support of the president of the UNAM and oddly of the Mexican Central Bank. I don't know what the deal was there, but they get all this support. And then they set up officially the Colmex. I think it's beautiful because it's Lázaro Cárdenas coming out and saying, we're going to put our money where our mouth is. We are a republic. We believe in freedom. We're opposed to fascism. There's a fascist uprising in Spain that has kicked out this democratically elected government. We shall give them a home. And a home they were given. El Colegio de Mexico is a tiny university. So the numbers, again, vary depending on the sources, but it is roughly 0.1% of the size of the UNAM. It is around 500 students, including undergraduate, master's, and doctoral programs. It is absolutely tiny. And despite that, it has produced some of Mexico's most highly regarded public intellectuals, academics, government officials, both at home and abroad.
I think the most prominent graduate from El Colegio de Mexico in the government today is Marcelo Ebrard, as far as I'm concerned. The current economy minister.
And the former foreign relations minister and former governor of Mexico City. And if we went back to around 2012, the man who everyone was relatively certain would be president.
How the times have changed since then.
How the times have changed. But of course, as I said just now in these statistics, when you compare a school in Mexico with anything else, you compare it with the UNAM. All of these universities, public or private, live in the shadow of the UNAM. They were often founded by people who studied the UNAM. They are a function of the UNAM. So stay tuned for our next episode on the UNAM, Mexico's National Autonomous University. Till next time, this was Gustavo Figueroa.
And I'm Alex Gonzalez Ormerod.
And this is Mexico, the podcast.
Every 2 weeks, we're telling you about the public, the private, and the UNAM. But that'll be next time.
Till then.